our next expert, who travels the longest way to be here with us, which we especially appreciate, Mr. Donovan Rypkema, President of Heritage Strategies International, Washington, D.C., USA.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you all very much. I'm always honored to be in Europe at a heritage event because everything that we know, we have learned from you, so thank you from the bottom of my heart. Usually, because I'm a numbers guy, usually I talk about numbers in a presentation like this. Instead, I'm going to do a context, but on all the tables, just so you can see some numbers, I left a report that we recently did for the state of Connecticut, and it's how we have kind of evolved to quantifying this valuable and sometimes immeasurable quality of heritage resources. So in 15 minutes, I'm going to give you 40 or so roles for heritage buildings. But to understand the role, you have to start out with two basic understandings. One, it's necessary to think beyond the monument. If we're going to move beyond tourism, we have to move beyond the monument to more everyday vernacular buildings. And second, there has to be a commitment to the adaptive reuse of buildings, central to their economic role. And heritage contributes to the economy really in four ways: directly, and I'll give you some examples of each of these; indirectly, functionally, by what those buildings do, and by providing context for other economic activities. These aren't all the categories of heritage economics contributions, but they're the ones I'll talk about, and there's some of the major ones. The work of heritage conservation itself, public sector savings, which around the world is a critical issue today, the issue of that we've already heard about today, community competitiveness and center city revitalization, education, housing as a business venue, and an emerging area of heritage buildings, that is public-private partnerships. Starting with this issue of just fixing up the old building. It is a labor-intensive activity, more labor-intensive than new construction, much, much, much greater local economic impact than almost any other type of economic activity. In the Connecticut report, you can see some examples from that state. Then there is the real skills and the conservation experts for the monuments. And it's just in places like both France and England, where there is a great industry, both of those places still have a shortage of skilled workers in heritage conservation. Here's work in the decorative arts. Here's an example of Germans teaching artisans in Vietnam on restoration. Suppliers and producers. This man happens to be in the UAE, but producing the products that are then incorporated into a heritage building. That is an important economic activity, and again, an area where there's a significant skills shortage around the world. Infrastructure savings, and again, in the center city here, you can see infrastructure going on. It's not that we don't have to replace that infrastructure in historic areas, but we don't have to extend it out to the edges. The buildings, the rest of the space is already there. It's just that periodic replacement. Landfill savings. Landfill is increasingly expensive, both in euros and environmental quality. And in both North America and in Europe, between a quarter and a third of everything at the landfill is from construction debris. Much of that torn down. Well, when we don't tear down and throw away the building, there is a public sector cost savings. The importance of the core of the city. This just moving statue in Rotterdam. That World War II, the core of Rotterdam was bombed, but they recognized the missing piece. It was the soul of the city, and this statue represents that. But that importance of the core of the city isn't limited to one who has lost it. We've all lost our cities, center cities, in one way or another. And it's center city revitalization, where I do much of my professional work. I cannot give you a single example worldwide of sustained success story in center city revitalization where heritage conservation wasn't an important part of that strategy. We've heard already about competitiveness, creation of civic identity. It's not just our identity as humans that we attach to our heritage, but the identity of our city, and that individualized identity is necessary for it to be economically competitive in an economically globalized world. If you think about these 6 places, Moscow and Athens and Agra, Rome and Salvador Bahia, Brazil, and Hanoi, those are distinct places, but I guarantee you that the shopping centers in those 6 places are exactly the same. It's these things that are creating that competitiveness and differentiation. And then this whole issue about historic buildings as venue for something else. They aren't heritage for the sake of heritage. They're heritage for use of something else, like this great exhibition hall right across from the Kremlin in downtown Moscow. The Louvre. Now, could we take all the artworks and display them someplace else? Of course we could. Would it be the same art collection? I would suggest not. Or the Opera House in Vienna. Could they sing opera in some other building? Of course they could. Would it be the same as in their heritage buildings? Certainly not. And then kind of moving down the scale, arts district like this one in Quito, Ecuador. These aren't grand monuments. These aren't World Heritage List categories. They're vernacular buildings, but they've been used as the creation of the whole arts district. And you move from that formalized, even though less formal, to the kind of street performers. It's those heritage buildings that provide that context. Can you imagine these performers performing in an office park or in front of a shopping center? It just wouldn't make sense. The great accordion players in the center city here in the context of those heritage buildings. The attraction for the creative class. And again, we've heard about that already, and it's part of the EU initiative. This happens to be a painter in the American city of New Orleans. And attraction for the young. Anyone who doesn't understand that the attraction of the creative class and the attraction of the young aren't central to economic development doesn't understand economic development. And then this is an amazing thing that happens. Here's 3 different countries in different parts of the world. But this issue, it's not enough to attract them, we have to keep them. So here's one of the most important events in one's life, one's marriage. Where are they getting their pictures, wedding pictures taken? In front of heritage buildings. It's that attachment of the human being to the physical manifestation of their heritage that those buildings represent. And then a gathering place for families, like here in Barcelona. That context for an active street life. It's not the street life, it's that the heritage buildings has created the context for there to be that active street life. Or for the passive street life, like this wonderful guy in the square in Quito, Ecuador. It's just part of it. Or for just context for watching the world go by. This is across from the Agora in Athens. Again, it's not the buildings, it's that the buildings have provided a context for a very important social and consequently economic activity. And then as the counterpoint to new architecture. Good historic cities are not frozen in time. Good historic cities reflect an evolution of the city over time. And in good places, and it happens to be a new museum, wonderful museum in Lille, France, that reflects the historic building right across, and it adds to the context one to the other. Strategy for small town revitalization. Certainly, major cities have seen heritage-based revitalization, but so have small towns like this one in Slovakia. And then the educational role of those buildings. Just being there, the lessons that are being learned, in this case by elementary school students in Cuenca, World Heritage City in Spain, and in the same city for high schools. And then the university context. Again, could you take all the professors out of Oxford University and still have them teach? Of course you could. Would that be the same education? I would suggest it's not. That 500, 600 years of that environment, in fact, adds to the whole of that university education. And then the whole thing about housing. We forget it. We think, well, we're dealing with monuments. We forget this historic buildings that people live in every day. And certainly like here in Paris, housing for the wealthy. Or in Naples, housing for the professional class. Or in Belgium, housing for the middle class. Or in Lisbon, housing for the working class. But every instance, there are heritage buildings housing citizens and attracting and holding those citizens to that community. One of probably the best study internationally on the relationship between heritage and property values was done in the city of Zaanstad, in the Netherlands. And there's a premium by the marketplace. Pei was exactly what Terry just talked about, what Pei was discovering about the housing. A premium for the monuments of almost 27%, even being close to the monuments, created a value premium for those, and simply being in a heritage district added a premium as well. In the U.S., as you know, we've been having a real estate crisis for the last 4 years. and huge numbers of foreclosure. We've looked at 5 cities in the U.S., and what we've discovered is all other variables accounted for, that the foreclosure rate of properties in historic districts was half of that in the same town, the same neighborhoods, same kind of neighborhoods that were not identified as historic neighborhoods. And the reason I think is this, is not that people who owned historic houses were more frugal or didn't get themselves in trouble, it's that in declines, the property values decline to a lesser degree, and so if I get in financial trouble, I can get that house sold before I go through that whole foreclosure process. Venue for local markets, like in Ljubljana. So the markets are there, and again, their wares are increased by their context within those historic buildings. Small neighborhood businesses. Again, this is in Spain. None of these are international monuments, but they are heritage buildings providing the everyday needs, goods, and services for the people living in that neighborhood. The location for specialty product businesses. That heritage building adds to credibility, authenticity, reality, localness of the goods and services sold out. Location for food and wine businesses. Again, it was kind of the Terry's, beer from France. It adds to the credibility, the authenticity of those local products. This one is in Lisbon. As a context for local crafts production. Being in a heritage building adds to the credibility of those local products. Here's rug makers in Aleppo in Syria. Here's a door maker, a woodworker in Vietnam, a plaster worker in Bahrain, and a weaver in Thailand. The only thing connecting these people is 2 things. They're making craft to sell, and they're making them within heritage buildings. Context for the informal economy. Now, in many parts of the world, still the informal economy is a major source of the economy. Can you imagine this woman selling those trinkets in front of a shopping center? Just doesn't make sense. It provides that center city with those heritage buildings provides her the context to make a living, to stave off starvation. We have heritage buildings that provide luxury, location for luxury goods businesses. And then, a fabulous example. The national government and the provincial government and the local government in Lille made a commitment to make it a major transportation center for, primarily train, for Europe. Huge success story. And a wonderful modern facility for those trains to come and go. But 3 blocks away is their 18th and 19th century city, and 10 blocks away is a medieval city, that there's not a contradiction between those two. That in fact, here can be this big continental transportation hub, and simply being in proximity to that heritage adds to the vibrancy of that place. And then finally, and I think an area that we all have to look more at, is the opportunities for especially in these troubled economic times, for public-private partnerships using heritage buildings. Public-private partnerships is not the same as privatization. It's not like selling them off. It's ways to attract private capital, and this wonderful hotel development in a public-owned historic resource in Romania is a great example. So there's those examples, but there's many, many, many more, and we've just started counting the ways that heritage resources add to our local economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting and I think inspiring as well.